And thank you for getting the door open, I think that's helpful. And welcome to people who've arrived. Hello. Great. We're going to shift completely. We're going to go to Wales for the next story. So, yeah, feel free to have a little stretch if you need one and take a breath. This is a story from the northeast of Monmouthshire, from an old county there. And it's a story that's laced through with Halloween. There is a mountain that stands on the northeastern border of Monmouthshire, and its slopes are studded with lots of small farms, but the peak stretches up and is often cloaked in mist above the tree line. The lives of many farm hands and many farm owners have ebbed and flowed across the slopes of that mountain for hundreds of years. But deep down below the earth, deep at the mountain's heart, there is a circle of old stone mothers. And sometimes they are sleeping, and sometimes they are watching. They know the turning of the years in their old stone bones. And every so often, they turn their heads up to watch one life in particular and give it their attention. Some years ago, there were 3 girls whose farms jostled shoulder to shoulder on the slopes of the mountain. Gwen and Sian and Nancy. And they'd known each other since they were little. They had played and laughed and learned and larked in the fields and the streams and the woods. Their favourite place to meet was under the hawthorn tree that grew where all their farms met on the slopes. And when it was Halloween, they would scare each other silly with stories of the Gwicki. Wait a second. They had this. The Gwicki, the dog of darkness, a hound that was said to come from hell itself. Eyes of blood, hot, fetid breath that was so acrid it could set the trees on fire. And if this dog met you in the darkness, if you looked it in the eyes, it might just take your soul. But this Halloween had a different significance, because those 3 young women, they were now young women, and they knew that if they didn't find out what was in store for them in the realm of love by Halloween, then the cold barrenness of winter might be the barrenness of their hearts as well. So from early summer they started to plot and plan. And they knew, they'd done a lot of research. They had 3 tests that they were going to do to divine the future of their love lives. Firstly, they started by weaving magic into their beds. Gwen, she put sweet meadow herbs in her pillow. Sian, she put clumps of wild flowers under her sheets. And Nancy, she slept on a mattress made of oat straw and rowan leaves. And they lay in these beds and they dreamt and they prayed that their lives would be full of love. And as summer started to rise in its long days, they did the first test. The first test was quite a simple one. They met under the hawthorn tree and each woman brought a slate, a pot, and a snail. They placed the slates under the tree, the snails on the slates and the pot over the top. And then together they ran, giggling back down the hill to do a whole day of work and come back again at sunset. Zoe, we might need another chair. Are we good? Yeah, great, thank you. So, snails on slates under pots, first bit of magic. When they came back again at sunset, as the sky was turning pink and orange, Gwen, the eldest, was going to go first. She approached her pot, lifted it up with a lot of nervous anticipation, and was delighted to see that her snail had made a trail. Her snail had made a trail in the shape of an S and a P. Surely the initials of whoever waited for her in the love story of her life. And when Gwen read that slimy S and that slimy P, her heart leapt. Maybe it was Sean Peters, he was so handsome. Maybe it was Sarah Poyce, she was so beautiful. If it was going to be either of them or even both, Gwen was delighted. She flushed from her chin to her head. It was Sean's turn, and Sean was heartened by Gwen's success. So she snatched the pot off the snail, and there was a kind of blurry, slurry, something slimy. Maybe an N, or an M, or maybe a W. And all three girls immediately started thinking, who do we know with names that begin with N or M or W? And there were probably a few possibilities. So Sean was grinning too. And then it was Nancy's turn. She stepped forwards full of hope. She lifted up that pot. And her snail hadn't moved at all. Not a single centimetre of slime. It was sat in exactly the same spot. Nancy checked the pot in case it had just gone up, but there was nothing. She felt her heart drop. Gwen and Sean, they squeezed her hands. Don't worry, this is just the first one. You probably just had a lazy snail. I've heard some snails can be defunct. And they took that snail off her slate and they threw it into the hedge. But as Gwen and Sean went home with a light skip down that hill, Nancy found it hard to lift her feet. But that was just the first test. There were more to come, more that were more complicated and more reliable. So a few weeks later they met in Sean's hayloft that had a view out over the track that led down towards the village. And they'd come prepared with sticks and twigs from apple trees and long straight lengths of wool. The next task was to make a ladder, to lower it from the hayloft down to the ground, and then one by one to wind it up, speaking an incantation. And as they wound, whoever passed by, that person would be part of the story. So Gwen, she went first. She lowered down this ladder of apple sticks and slowly wound it in. I am winding. Who is holding? I am winding. Who is holding? I am winding. Who is holding? Suddenly they heard the sound of voices. They saw figures out on the trail. And as all three girls strained to look, walking past on their way to the fields, Sean and Sarah. And Gwen couldn't hold back a laugh of delight as she saw both the SPs from her snail walking right past. Triumph lit a little fire for Gwen. And then it was Sean's turn. Sean lowered down that ladder, she began to wind it in. I am winding, who is holding? I am winding, who is holding? I am winding, who is holding? I am winding. The ladder was almost all the way up. When suddenly then there was a voice, a laugh, someone talking, someone they couldn't see. Gwen went down, scrambling out to see if she could see for Sean. Whoever it was had gone, but there had been someone. And Sean felt a little hug inside her chest. So then it was Nancy's turn. The ladder down, she began to wind, and she wound it very slowly. I am winding. Who is holding? Nancy took her time, and all three girls strained and strained and strained. But the ladder wound all the way up, and not a person in sight or sound. And again, Gwen and Sian, they tried to comfort Nancy, but she didn't want their comfort. She wanted to take that ladder and throw it down off the hayloft and smash it into pieces. She went home on her own and felt that tight worry like a knot. As summer stretched into autumn, and the days grew colder, darker, lit with falling leaves, the girls met for a third test. And this one was more important, because this was not just about this year, this was about the life to come. This test, 3 bowls, one full of clear spring water, one full of murky pond water, and one empty. Each would be blindfolded, the bowls moved, and whichever they reached out and touched, then they'd know if love would be clear and true, complicated, or not at all. Gwen went first. The blindfold on, the bowls moved, and her hand shot straight into the clear spring water bowl. She knew it now. The love story was only a matter of time away from filling her life. Sian's turn. The blindfold on, the bowls moved, and she was slow, hesitant. Her fingers dipped into the pond water, murky, muddy. So things would be complicated, but there would be things. And then it was Nancy's turn. The blindfold on, the bowls moved. And deep down in the earth beneath the mountain, the stone mothers were waking and watching. Nancy took her time, a deep breath, a deep wish. And when she stretched out her hand, her fingers reached nothing. The empty bowl. When she pulled off the blindfold, she couldn't look at Gwen or Sian. She turned and she left, and she ran all the way home, dashing at her eyes with the heels of her hands. So this was it. This was what was fated for her. Absolutely nothing. No lover, no love, no one to hold her, no one to tell her they loved her, no one to look in her eyes and see only her. That was really it. All that waited. She got home, she felt hot anger burning. She thought, this nonsense that we've done so far, enough. But there's another test. There's one more, and I'm going to do it myself, and I'm not going to tell anyone. They discarded this one because it was quite complicated and quite a faff. But Nancy, she was going to do it. What this involved was finding a chicken that had yet to lay a single egg. Waiting, coaxing, finding that first egg, and when it was laid, cracking it open and mixing the egg and the yolk and the white with half an eggshell of salt and half an eggshell of flour, making a baked cake. Eating half the cake, putting half under your pillow, and waiting in the night for something to come as a sign. So, Nancy told not a soul. But she found one chicken that had still not lain. It was thin and scrawny and destined only for the pot. And Nancy, she poured all of her devotion into that bird. She sat with that bird on her lap and she stroked and she stroked and she crooned and she sang. She gave blessings to that hen. She gave it all the prayers, all the wishes. She went out into the garden and she found worms and she found grain to feed it from her own hand. She kept it warm at night. She poured her love into that hen. And on the day before Halloween, finally, there in her lap, it laid an egg. Nancy took it in her hands. She went straight to the stove. She cracked that egg into a bowl. She filled half the shell with salt. She filled half the shell with flour. She mixed it. She made a cake. She put the cake into the oven, and when it came out, half into her mouth and half under her pillow. And by the time she went to bed, the thirst was so strong. But this was the test. Who would come in the night to give her water? That would be the one. She fell into a fitful sleep. And in her sleep, she dreamed. She dreamt that she went to the pump to find herself a drink, and the pump was dry. She dreamt she went to the well and lowered a bucket, and the well was dry. She dreamt she went to the stream to fill up a flask, and the stream was dry. And she woke with her throat so parched. No one had come. As dawn rose, so rose Nancy's temper. All of this nonsense. She was done with the lot of it. She threw a shawl out onto the floor of her room. She pulled that mattress full of its oat straw and its rowan leaves and all of her prayers. She emptied all of that onto the shawl. The half of the cake she hadn't eaten, that went in. The blindfold, the apple twigs, the wool. She bundled it all up. And with that bundle under one arm, she set off up the mountain. I will throw the whole lot off the top and be done with the whole thing if this is all I'm destined for. The bundle under one arm, and up she went. Nancy knew that mountain like the back of her own hand. She strode and she skipped, striding on, up and up and up over the stone paths that she knew. But deep down in the mountain, the stone mothers were watching. Nancy strode up the path she knew, when suddenly her feet missed the path. It seemed as though the stones shifted underfoot, and suddenly she was falling, stumbling, slipping, tumbling, down, down, down. She clutched that bundle tight as she fell, head over heels, down, down, down the side of the mountain. A boulder stopped her fall. A deep bruise immediately blossoming on her thigh. And the whole mountainside felt unfamiliar. A part of it she didn't recognize. And a silence, thick as fog. Nancy stood looking at this unfamiliar place. Suddenly there was a sound echoing through the silence, the sound of horses' hooves riding. And as she looked there, out of the mist that was descending down, the horse's hooves, a horse galloping, faster and faster and faster and faster, it flew past her. A grey mare with eyes rolling with fear. It was flecked with sweat, its mouth frothing with foam. Its reins flew in the wind, its stirrups riderless, it ran. She watched it go past, flattening herself back as it flew. And as it ran and she looked back where it had come, behind it, there was a growing, seeping darkness that billowed down the side of the mountain, writhing, tendrils of dark that reached out. Nancy felt the air around her being sucked in. She felt her own energy being pulled in, her life, her breath. The darkness swallowed everything before it, gaping wide. And then in the middle of the dark, she saw two eyes burning dark red. She heard a deep guttural growl. And as dark filled every corner of the day, the growling, burning eyes came closer and closer, and she saw, leaping out of that darkness straight towards her down the mountain, the Gwiki, the dog of darkness, the hound of hell. It gave a roar that trembled the stones of the mountain. It came leaping out, and then its paws were pounding down, coming closer and closer and closer, and Nancy remembered, if you meet the dog of darkness, you meet your own doom, and your soul will be taken. And she thought, this is it then. She stepped into its path. Just as the dog leapt towards her, she threw that bundle straight at its face. And the shawl opened in the air. The contents rained down. And just as Nancy closed her eyes as the dog grew ever closer, suddenly, stillness. And she opened her eyes to see the dog sat, perfectly calm, in a circle of oat straw and rowan leaves, breadcrumbs, apple twigs, wool. And its eyes weren't blazing red, they were just the deep eyes of a dog. And its coat wasn't coated in smoke and blood. It was just the shiny, soft fur of a dog. It looked at Nancy and it whined and got up. Sit! It sat. And Nancy, she smiled. She looked. And then she heard the clip-clopping of hooves. She saw the horse coming back up the mountain. And as she whistled, it came over. She took the reins, got onto its back, whistled for the dog, which left its circle of straw and twigs, and came limping at her side up that mountain path that she didn't know. Higher and higher they climbed, and the last tendrils of mist parted, and there was the horse's rider, who'd been thrown and was sat nursing bruises. The rider saw Nancy. Coming up the slopes, the horse and the hound, light in her hair, light in her eyes. She looked like something coming out of a myth. Who are you? I'm Nancy. And this is the dog of darkness. And this, I believe, is your horse. The rider nodded. Nancy got down and handed over the reins, and their hands met. Where are you going? She asked. And the rider told how they were off to deliver a message to their cousin in the village. But then I'm waiting to see what the world can hold. I have no plan, just possibility and adventure. And Nancy liked the sound of that. She said, well, I'm heading up the mountain. I have a pilgrimage to finish. But when I come back down, my path will take me past a hawthorn tree that's on your path too. And the rider said, "It won't take me long to deliver this message." And a hawthorn tree sounds like just the spot from which to see what the world might bring and what adventures are waiting. Nancy liked the sound of that. She carried on up the mountain, watched the rider riding down. She had the hawthorn tree in her mind, and she knew that this was just the start of the story. Deep down below the earth, the old stone mothers murmured in delight as they watched those two choosing their path. And in the middle of the circle of stone, a dog with deep red eyes snuffled, curled up